la Conferencia Magistral de la doctora Margaret McColl, que bueno, ya ahorita voy a leer su semblanza, pero me parece sensacional. Se titula Expresando lo invisible, la cruda verdad de hacer invisible a la mujer en los museos. Voy a leer su semblanza y después le vamos a dar un fuerte aplauso porque se viene muy bueno lo que vamos a escuchar. La doctora Margaret McColl es profesora titular y líder del programa de educación de museos de la Universidad de Glasgow. Es profesora titular en educación de museos y patrimonio en la Universidad de Glasgow, donde lidera el programa de máster en educación de museos. En 2020 fundó un consorcio internacional para el International Master of Education in Museums and Heritage, EDUMaH, un innovador programa para educadores del siglo XXI que obtuvo una beca Erasmus Mundus Joint Degree en 2022, financiando 90 becas. Autora de múltiples publicaciones sobre educación de museos, creatividad y formación docente, Maggie también es coeditora de la próxima publicación The Routledge Handbook of Museum and Heritage Education. Ha colaborado con importantes instituciones como el Smithsonian Institute y Science Gallery Bangalore, desarrollando programas globales enfocados en temas como tecnología, género, raza e historias decoloniales. Con su enfoque multidisciplinario, Maggie ha dejado una huella significativa en la educación de museos y patrimonio a nivel internacional. Le damos la más cordial bienvenida a la doctora Margaret McColl.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I would just like to say a thank you to Professor Yvonne Lona from the Ibero University for the invitation to talk today, but also to Gabriella, who gave us that wonderful introduction to the conference itself. So it's a pleasure to be here in Mexico City with you. I love Mexico City. It's one of my favourite places in the world insofar as I've travelled. So it's an absolute honour to be here today to offer some of my thoughts, ideas and musings around this particular topic. Today I want to explore the representation of women in museums, their visibility as exhibits and narratives, but also in the profession. The presentation is centred around a small research project conducted in collaboration with my good friend and colleague Delia Wilson, who is here today as well, and is very much a collaborative effort. The study reveals a small but important sample of current experiences, perceptions and attitudes of women managers in museums. It provides a global swab, if you like, of contemporary lived experience in relation to women's representation in museums and galleries in 2025. I will begin by offering ideas and musings from those invested in the field to set some context and background to the study. I will then consider the possible detrimental effect that removing women's stories from society, history and culture might have on the educational development of girls and women in society in terms of shaping their educational and career choices. I will conclude by considering some possibilities for a more positive, authentic approach to the uncomfortable subject of women in museums. So it's 40 years since the formation of the Guerrilla Girls. This New York-based activist group used irony, artistry and dark humour to draw the world's attention to the inequities of gender and race in the museum world. In particular, they highlighted the tokenistic approach that besets the representation of women artists in museums and galleries. 40 years later, where are we? The gender imbalance that informs and controls that with which the public engages in the museum context persists, suggesting a patriarchal an elusive picture of what is considered worthy of public consumption and engagement. The statistic offered by the Guerrilla Girls almost 40 years ago, that the majority of artworks of women in New York's Metropolitan Museum are nudes, hasn't changed, hence this particular slide. So Clover, darling Clover, tells us that representation is a signifying practice. It always means something about something else. That which is acted out in institutional settings, such as museums, with the intent to influence knowledge and perception. In other words, it's the seen aspect of representation that sticks with us, stays in our minds and solidifies any meaning that we form. In a museum, this can be text, photograph, object, architecture, but if we're casual, careless, or even intentional about what isn't seen, then historical facts, realities, and stories can be lost or distorted. The picture I show here might be considered by some as uncomfortable. It's an anatomical cast of a woman's uterus containing a growing fetus. It's part of a series commissioned by William Hunter, the namesake of the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow. It's a very, very old object. The cast provides an anatomical depiction of pregnancy, development, and there is no doubt these casts transformed the field of obstetrics in the medical world. However, there are uncomfortable questions to be asked. The Hunterian Museum and Art Gallery have a slim representation of women in their exhibits and narratives. This is something they're redressing and making good progress on. But this gravid uterus is one of a minority of ways in which women in the museum are actually represented. If we look beyond our admiration for Hunter's pioneering medical skills, we must ask some uncomfortable questions. We must consider how this cast was created. How was the female body section sourced? How was the fetus placed within the uterus? Given the date of the cast creation, it's highly unlikely permission was sought from the subject to use her body as a model. Might there be a tension here then between sharing the story of groundbreaking scientific progress at the expense of female exploitation? On the topic of women in museums, the ICOM published the Gender Mainstreaming Resolution in 2013, passing it in 2016. Their statement suggests a commitment to increasing the visibility of women in museums. Since 2017, ICOM has been promoting the role of women in museums during International Women's Day through the hashtag Women in Museums. This has become a hub in social media platforms to share and celebrate the work of female museum professionals, women artists, and women in history. With this campaign, they aim at highlighting the many ways in which women shape museums, from shifting narratives to fighting for inclusion. But surely we need more than just celebratory days. Acknowledgement of the significance of gender diversity in museums can help to ensure the inclusion and integration of a wide range of perspectives and experiences in exhibition curation and museum programming. In turn, this might go some way to tackling the pressing issue of decolonisation of museum collections and narratives. The topic itself is recognised as a research area in need of attention, which, in the third decade of the 21st century, is interesting. Clover informs us that for every story told, countless others have been kept silent, and that this silence is highly gendered. Clover asserts that museums have taught hundreds of visitors, consciously and unconsciously, that masculine words, deeds, histories, subjectivities and ways of knowing are worthy of preserving, showing and telling. According to Clover, museums have taught these same visitors that women and others oppressed by gender norms have little historical or subjective import. The embedded masculinizing agenda not only distorts and biases, but whitewashes centuries of patriarchal privilege, control and violence. In Presence and Power, Callahan and Feldman tell us it's time for a new intersectional feminist agenda that focuses on increased representation for women of colour and gender minorities in the field, from presence to power. The authorities noted the stagnation and paralysis of the work so ably started through the revolutionary tactics of the Guerrilla Girls, informing us that just a few years ago, despite the percentage of working visual artists identifying as women being 51%, over a monitored 6-year period, only 27% of solo shows at major museums in the United Kingdom and USA were actually by women artists, and that only 3 to 5% of major permanent collections in the US and Europe are attributable to women. Callahan and Feldman suggest Museums and galleries have too often abdicated their responsibility for creating a comprehensive feminist agenda. So this passive attitude must change if a difference is to be felt. It's through the work of museum educationalists, the employment of strong, guiding feminist frameworks, that Callaghan and Feldman suggest the possibility of institutional change. They also champion an inclusive definition of feminism that encompasses a universal womanhood. So women of colour, Indigenous women, LGBTQ women, and women with disabilities. For this reason, they promote the use of an intersectional feminist framework for use in museums and galleries. In Sex and Power, Jewel and Baisley write that women are significantly underrepresented in positions of power. And Black, Asian and minority ethnic, BAME women or disabled women fare even worse. In the museum world, this is certainly the case. The study Sex and Power, published in 2018, highlighted just 21.7% of women chair museum boards in the UK, while only 34% of directors are women. Mind you, this is an improvement on the 2013 survey that recorded a woeful 9.3% of board chairs in the UK being women and 28% directors. So change is proving too slow. Another interesting fact from the 2018 Sex and Power survey is that of the 826 public statues in the UK's Public Monument and Sculpture Association's database, only 25 of them are women. Significantly, in 2018, almost 70% of applications to study in the creative arts and design sector in the UK were from women. Yet, a significant majority of senior staff in art and design institutions, and certainly those paid the highest and the big decision makers, are men. So why the inversion between academic commitment with a view to professional aspiration compared with the stark reality of what happens in the senior management workplace? Worryingly, Macmillan suggests the culture and creative industries are a microcosm of wider social values whereby women's labour is far less valued. So does any of this matter? Okay. Well, according to the United Nations, representation of women is not only a matter of equality, it's one which can and would have a massive impact on society. Increased visibility of women in society more generally and increased female perspectives in decision making could not only improve governance to wider considerations of the needs of communities, but is likely to drive policy considerations to healthcare, education and family welfare. However, while decision making continues to be dominated by outdated male tradition, then how can this be changed? And more importantly, how is this impacting on wider society, particularly on young females making life decisions? According to STEM, a group representing science, technology, engineering and maths, only 31% of students in higher education in the UK were women. If we consider engineering and maths, the number of females is even lower. Despite efforts to increase representation of women in STEM workforce, numbers remain stubbornly low. Government figures suggest equal numbers will not be reached until 2070. Based on ability in sciences at school age, confidence and self-efficacy, girls who were expected to complete a STEM degree still did not. Some subjects are particularly underrepresented, such as computer science and technology. However, these also represent the most lucrative areas for the workplace. A whole raft of reasons feed into this data, including the failure to offer equal educational opportunities to girls historically. However, in more recent times, expectations range from women not actually being credited with work to the fact that Nobel panels are composed predominantly of men. Despite calls to action by various governments and bodies such as UNESCO for gender-sensitive approaches to teaching and learning, progress remains slow and gender discrimination appears to be common in curriculum content. Higher education should, in theory, be key drivers of equality and social change. But are they? It might be expected that in the 21st century, universities would be a powerful voice, promoting gender equality, diversity and inclusion in all aspects of society. But what is the reality? Many of the identified factors that affect career progression and career aspirations, and so the status quo continues. There is evidence that many countries have recognised these disparities, both from an equality point of view and an economic one. But progress is slow and variable. Sustainability is an issue, with many initiatives existing as pilots. Programmes are not always targeted at those communities where gender bias is still rife. And gender bias in curricula and teacher attitude remains an issue, with a lack of positive role models in all aspects of society a critical point. In other words, what girls do not see, they will not seek to emulate, aspire to, or even better. So that which is invisible works to reinforce gender assumptions, stereotypes, and negativities. But where are we now? Earlier this year, my colleague Delia and I conducted a small-scale research study to explore the representation of women in museums in 2025. While the study is just small-scale, with only 10 participants invited to take part, all agreed and completed our questionnaire. We specifically targeted women in positions of management in museums and galleries who work in a range of museums, from small community museums to large municipal museums. The first question we asked was, does your museum have a policy on the representation of women in museums and galleries? Of the 10 participants asked, only one indicated their museum has a policy, though others had plans and strategies in place to improve the representation of women in their museums. Next, we asked, how does this statistic from 11 years ago compare with the collection in your museum or gallery today? 70% stated that the situation would be the same or is even less. 10% of the participants estimated round about 40%. And 3 museums were actively involved in improving this through temporary exhibitions. In response to, is your museum gallery making efforts to increase representation of women in the collection and to increase the profile of women artists more generally, the general view was that women managers in museums were actively trying to increase representation. Clearly, Women's Day is a driving force, with specific days in March dedicated to women artists. Use of travelling exhibitions between women-only museums is also common. And though temporary exhibitions, which with contemporary collections of which we are active, however, we are trying to exhibit more women artists than male artists, all suggest efforts are being made to encourage more effort in terms of women promoting women. The question asking about impact of increased representation of women in museums and visitor engagement elicited some very positive responses, suggesting education is viewed as a vehicle to facilitate and activate change. One participant said it makes you appear less elitist as a museum. You become more of a place of dialogue and diversity as a museum. By showing multi-voices, you teach visitors to question existing power structures. Another said, schools is the obvious source. Children need to see female representation on walls and to know there are works by women. We do a lot of work around women's rights and focus on arts and crafts. When asked to share perceptions on the representation of women employees, museums employ more women than men, yet the majority of directors and senior management roles are noted as still being for men. Okay. All respondents wish to represent all areas of society, and adolescents are a target group. So what does this study suggest about perceptions, practices and realities now? Well, museums can and should be instrumental in representing women's voices. These voices can and should be drivers which inspire and influence young people in making life choices, particularly young women. The majority of women staff are female and they have a strong desire to represent their voices and the voices of other women. The role of men, both in the present and historically, continue to strongly influence how the voices of women are heard. So what does it look like when museums get it right? So feminist museology and feminist theories can play a big role in making substantive, sustained change. In 2019, Tate Britain showcased the work of British women artists from the 60s to the present day, and the Tate Britain have committed to actively purchasing and exhibiting an increased number of women artists in their collections. Another excellent example is the Smithsonian Women's History Museum. This is very much a case of active practice across a huge organisation to bring to the surface stories of women that have been absent for years. It started as an online museum and archive and is continuing as such, but a physical museum is on the way. The voices of women from history have been amplified across their museum sites. Though exhibitions like We Who Believe in Freedom at the Martin Luther King Library are wonderful examples of increasing the voices of women and sharing their histories in a very public setting. Another example is where in the Smithsonian Women's History Museum, such as Air and Space, which has predominantly been a male sense of a museum, a male flavour of a museum, we have stories about women like Katherine Johnston now coming to the fore. A long-time NASA mathematician and hidden figure previously, Smithsonian now has the story of Katherine Johnston in their collection and uses it as part of their tour guide. In Scotland, my own country and where I come from, in the city of Glasgow, the Glasgow Women's Library is another example. It's a library, an archive and a museum, but importantly, it's a welcoming community resource in a socially and economically deprived part of the city. Glasgow Women's Library really challenges our concept of what a museum is. This is a particularly socially, economically deprived part of Glasgow. Women can walk in, anybody can walk in from the street. They can be welcomed with a coffee, a tea, something to eat. They can just read the books, they can look at the exhibitions, they can participate in workshops, they can look at the archives. It's very much a place of the people and a place for the community. Feminist museum pedagogy runs through these examples. And Darlene Clover, a leader in the field, her feminist museum hack is one approach to shift women from the margins to the centre, where they can be in the present. The hack invites questioning, disbelieving and dissenting. It asks, how can we critically and creatively challenge the gendered codes concealed in the dioramas, artworks, displays, exhibitions and texts of museums? How do we render visible the indiscernible masculine gaze and disrupt the logic of the gendered hierarchies it naturalises? How do we participate in our own learning as creators rather than as mere consumers of prescribed facts? What imaginative possibilities can arise from interrogating and revisualising how masculinities and femininities are performed through representation in museums? And what pedagogical process could afford us deeper viewing the possibilities of play and of rewriting representations as arenas for gender concerns? So what can be done? So perhaps we can think about critical and creative strategies, including her story. Animation, reframing, recentering, rescripting, reclaiming, and revisualising feminists. We can think about recognition, acknowledgement and value of women's cultural, political, aesthetic, social and scientific capacities, capabilities and contributions. We can promote collaborative policy on positive promotion of representation of women in museums, including X, Y and Z. We can foster strong community collaborations and activism in educational programming and the curation of exhibits to give voices to girls, women, BAME, Indigenous communities. We can explore and promote visual literacy skills in formal education contexts to encourage visual criticality of how gender is represented. So final thoughts, what could be done? Increased engagement of young people in promoting positive stories about women through the application of feminist pedagogies. Stand up, so I can read that better. Methodologies and interventions. Feminist adult education. We can shift behaviour in museums from the male gaze to the female gaze, using Clover, Tabor and Samver's feminist museum hack. We can actively participate in the publication of research and scholarship activity that addresses the need for and the advantages of representation of women in museums. So when we limit, misrepresent or exclude stories as museums worldwide have done for centuries, we lose valuable historical, social, cultural and epistemic resources. To transform this problematically gendered world, all our stories need to be told, seen, heard and equally importantly, taken seriously. Women and others excluded by gender norms must be able to see and critique oppressions that hide in plain sight. So what's possible? Well, we know that the Guerrilla Girls had their very ironic statement of the advantages of being a women artist, where great irony was used to playfully think about the sort of things like, not being paid enough money and never getting work and that type of thing. But perhaps we need to shift that type of tone and think about something that's a really positive approach. Thinking about the advantages of making women visible in museums. We could have improved attitudes towards equity and social justice. It could create reduced toxic masculinity stemming from, for example, social media. It could increase acknowledgement and understanding of women's contributions to history, culture and social progression. It could increase understandings of the complexity of womanhood and femininity. It could increase the number of women in cultural management and leadership positions. It could acknowledge and redress patriarchal focused cultural and social narratives. It could encourage youth groups to actively discuss and address intersections of gender, power and identity. And it could absolutely celebrate women's stories to aid our understanding of humanity more generally. Thank you. I think that's probably quite a different culture compared with the United Kingdom, where I am from. So that's obviously a cultural difference that you are describing. So it's not something that we necessarily need to deal with in the UK. But what I would say is that I think it's through, you have to start small. We've seen that in the UK, we've seen it in other countries in Europe, that it's very small, it's been very small steps. And just beginning with things like Darlene Clover's feminist museum hack or an encouraging students. I think it's through education you can make a huge difference to perceptions and to behaviour. And so, for instance, we have students on our International Masters where we talk to them about these types of themes and ideas, and they're coming from all over the world. And so we share different practices, but we also exchange ideas about how different countries and cultures might respond to the kind of problem that you are describing. So I think small steps, but also insofar as is possible, it's always good to expose these types of behaviours, if it's possible at all, to write about them. That's where scholarship and research can be really important. It can offer an opportunity and a voice to talk about something that is a particular injustice in terms of practice.
¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta que quiera hacer? ¿Podrías? A ver, aquí hay dos. Y creo que con esos terminamos, si es que... Deja de mic.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great to hear you. I would like to ask about your opinion regarding one of President Trump's acts called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. There's one specific point regarding the American Women's History Museum that says that not to address trans women participating in women's sports. And that's really interesting because it's affecting, of course, not only that museum, but other museums in the United States. And this is like one of the examples of the critical situation we are living in the museum sector, more specifically with the LGBTQ community. So I just want to hear your insight regarding this case specifically. Thank you.
Thank you. So I am on the Museum Education Roundtable, which is an organisation based in Washington, and I'm on the editorial board of the Journal for Museum Education. And I work with a lot of people who work in the USA, in museums and galleries, and who work in the Smithsonian. And I've had friends and colleagues who work in the Smithsonian for a long time. And I know how, upset isn't a strong enough word, but I know how scared they actually are. I know that they are distressed and quite traumatised in some respects about what is happening, because these are newly released additions to the policies around the American Women's History Museum. When I've worked with it in the past, and it was a very liberal organisation which was empowered by women, with women, to tell these stories as freely as they wanted to. There were never any kind of embargoes on their voices or what they could and couldn't do. And they absolutely viewed women in its many forms in terms of terminology and definition. So all I can say is that I know there is a lot of distress around what is happening in museums in the US, and a genuine fear to be able to speak out or act, because we have seen what happens when people try to speak out recently in America around the Smithsonian Institute, where people have lost jobs and people are losing jobs. Organisations, initiatives that were up and running and were making a huge difference to communities have just been closed down. So it's dreadful, it's shocking, it's very difficult, but again, I do think, what do we have left then? We have scholarship and research, publications. It's a way to still get our voices out and to be able to be heard. Thank you.
There's one last question over there. Una última pregunta antes de continuar con la mesa 2.
Thank you very much. In terms of the reception of the audience, do you think that in the UK the audience is more receptive to men creators, artists, than to female creators? I am asking this because listening to your conference, I understood that you were talking about museums policies as institutions, but if you know something regarding the perception of the audience. And here in Mexico and in Latin America, I see, because my expertise is audience, and there is no difference. So Remedios Varo, Leona Carrington, Frida Kahlo, Maria Izquierdo, they provoke the same enthusiasm and effervescence and emotion and fanatism within, I am talking about only about the audiences. So that that demand of the audiences has an impact in the museum's policies. Where I come from Chile, same thing. People get crazy about Violeta Parra. And so, in particular in the UK, do you think that audience is equally motivated and fan of museum women painters and artists as well as men? Is equal as here?
Thank you. It's a really, really interesting question because I think that, I think there is obviously a very, very strong support for increasing the representation and profile of women artists in museums and galleries in the UK. So I think it's something that's in the consciousness of people, including visitors in the UK. I think, again, it's quite difficult when historically that we know that collections and exhibits have been very much around a patriarchal society, and so it's change is slow, but I think there's an increased awareness now, and people are talking, certainly in the UK, about how we can create more diverse exhibitions that offer greater diversity of artists, not just women, obviously greater diversity in its entirety. So I think audiences in the UK are very conscious and aware of the need for diversity in all different walks of life. And so that spills out into the museum or the gallery and vice versa. But I think it's slow, and getting word out there and engaging people is difficult. But again, that's where I come back to education. And that's why, I wanted to talk about beginning with very young people, because that's where you've got to start, and starting to encourage them to engage with these types of debates. When I was a little girl, for instance, in school, all of the posters of people in professions were men, and that's changed hugely already. But we have to keep going in that direction, because these are your future museum visitors. So you have to begin with them, and I think slowly, you have that appetite and you have that awareness. You need the awareness before you have the appetite. And I think slowly that will begin to happen more and more.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Maggie. Thank you.